Welcome to the fun session, Hiding in the Clouds, how attacker can use applications for persistence and how to find it. I'm Gloria Lee, and I'm with my beautiful colleague, Oana Enache. We're program managers in the Identity Division at Microsoft. We're responsible for Azure Active Directory Federation Services, and we work on teams that works with many customers on their deployments of Azure Active Directory. And we take those learnings and the feedback from those deployments, we'll get back into the product to make it easier and better for everyone. So if you have Office 365, and people here probably attending in the security conference sometimes don't spend a lot of time in identity space like Oana and myself, but if you do have Office 365, you have Azure Active Directory, as we work with a lot of customers on this issue. So I think you may also known or heard that we have some good stuff here. So let's take a look at the agenda slide. We're going to share, so what we're going to first cover here is what is application consent and why should you care about it? If you aren't already, and I'm going to talk about some of those key permissions you should be looking for, and Oana is going to find some of the stuff in your environment with you during the demo. And then lastly, we're going to cover some best practices and then things that you can go do. So there's a lot of fun stuff in this talk. We're going to make the slides available at the very end. Hopefully we have lots of good things you can go back and do in your environment to protect yourself. Why should you care about applications if you haven't been doing so already? On average, an organization will have 140 apps, but this can be a number that varies greatly depending on the size of your organization. So some of the customers that we work with are extremely large, and it's not uncommon to have thousands and thousands of applications. One of the customer our team is working with is modernizing all their applications to move to Azure AD. If you take a guess how long it would take, they think it's going to take them anywhere from 7 to 9 years to move all the application to modernize authentication. So 140 is just kind of like a low number, but you probably know better than anyone how many applications you have in your environment. 87% of the user today can consent to applications in the act of consenting to an application, which we will get to here shortly, isn't necessarily bad or malicious. But there are some things that allowed application to do in your environment, which you may or may not want them to do. As blue teamers, as defenders, we really care about these offenses. So you may not be aware of these uprising threats with the application consent, but you do need to. As architects, as security folks, blue teamer defenders, because just because you can consent an application means application can do stuff you may or may not want it to do, depending on your environment, your organization, risk tolerance, and things like that. From our learning, we see 80% of employees are using not approved apps when working. And you probably heard about this term called shadow IT. Then again, shadow IT doesn't mean it's malicious, doesn't mean that they are intended to do bad things, but if you don't pay attention, it could cause compromise or security incident in your environment. So if you haven't started paying attention, you really should. What is an application consent? I'm going to move the slide here. You're probably familiar with this. With your mobile phone, you can add an application from the App Store. When you add the application, it's going to be started asking a bunch of permissions that it wants to be able to do. So it wants to maybe access your camera because it's going to take your picture. And it needs modification permissions because you may want to put funny faces or editing or write messages, whatever that you're going to do. The application wants to access your photo library so you can edit the photos. And it also wants to access your contacts so that way you can send the funny photo directly from the application to your coworkers, friends, or family, things like that. So the application consent model in Azure AD and most cloud applications are as such. Oana and I are going to talk about from Azure AD perspective, but this applies to any OAuth OpenID Connect application as well, not just specific to Azure AD. So this is where we're going to talk from our point of view, the consent model of the application consent and permission. Very similar model in Azure Active Directory. So we have an application that is going to want to have access to organization data. And the organization data is going to be exposed via resource APIs. And there's different permission levels for those APIs. So we're going to get into all of that in a little bit. And those permissions can be granted through the process called application consent. And we have two different types of consent. We have an admin consent and we have a end user consent. So let's go over some key terms here. Let's talk about these different terms. It's going to be high level, but it allows us to dig in to align ourselves to open ID OAuth type of specs. So the first thing here is we have a term called client application. This is going to be like the mobile app, web app, and it can be an application that's running in the background that is going to be requesting data on behalf of that user. Then we have the resource application, which is going to be usually a web API that exposes this data or functionality. um, it is called Microsoft Graph. And then we have permissions, which is what the client application is asking to be able to perform on that data owned by that resource. Here we have a screenshot of this. Take a look. You may have seen this in your environment where we have an application here. And this one is called Contoso Test App. This application would like to read and share user contacts, sign in and read user profile, read and share user calendars. This is going through Microsoft Graph. Another example is OneDrive. Some application wants to read your files in the OneDrive box. This is kind of like the dialogues box and it's going to look like. So Oana will be showing you a demo later and walk through these. Now, next we need to take a look at the consent terms, because it's also very important. As we walk through this, if you've never seen this before, but let's talk about these terminology. These dialog box that we just showed you earlier, it's called consent prompt. And then we have the act of saying yes. It's called consent grant. It is pretty straightforward, but here's what's going to be different, a little bit of a, the phone type of model that we talked about. You may or may not be used to. I'm guessing here everyone is probably used to that model. So in the process of an administrator consent is when someone with administrative permissions is going to be granting access to an application. And we do this because of two different reasons. The first reason is the application may be asking for permissions that are highly privileged. And we don't want the end users to have the ability to say that's okay, because they may not take time to understand the permissions being asked. They don't understand the risk it could be exposed to the business, and so they shouldn't be able to do this. So the application may be asking for the ability to rewrite all the mailboxes. Maybe the reason is because it's an e-discovery app, right? So we don't want end user to be able to say that is okay, because that is a lot of permissions. And instead, the admins will have to go in there and say, well, this is a very privileged operation. But as an admin, we're going to say okay before we can add it to our directory. The other reason why you might do this as an administrator is because when administrator does consent to grant from an application, they're actually consenting this application to all the users in their directory. So then the user will not see the consent dialog box. So the first example that I can think about this to help is that the native mail client in iOS, or in fact any other mail app. So say you're going to use the mail client with Exchange Online. The user opens up the mail app, they put their username and password in, and they do this whole authentication flow. Then the application prompts them for the consent grant experience. Wants to be able to read to their mailbox, read their calendars, like basic stuff. The user can say, yes, I can do that. And they go ahead and click through. Now the native mail app on their iOS device gets mail. But before we can say, as administrator or defenders, we can say we review and trust this application. We're okay if people use that, and we want to improve end user experience. We're going to go in there as administrator and do administrative consent for this application. Now, the next person that goes to use the native mail app for the first time, they will not have to consent to the application any longer, because as administrator, we've already done that consent. Let's go into some permission terms here, which will help us understand the different type of the permission models. So there are two different type of permission that application can consent to. But the first one here is what we want most application to be using, which is called delegated permission model. The requirement for the application to work in the delegated permission model is that the user must be signed in and present for the application to make calls on behalf of that user. So this is what most end users can consent to. And if it's a higher privilege permission, it can also require admin to get involved to consent to this application. Now, this is where people tend to get a little tripped up or confused because of the effective permission model of the delegated permission. It is like the intersection of the user's underlying permissions and what the application can be granted to do. What do I mean by that? Let's say this application is like the best search application ever. It's the best thing for searching SharePoint sites and is asking for the ability to read all SharePoint sites. And the user consent to this. Let's say user has permission to do consenting the permission. They consent the application, they're going to use it, and they're not getting the ability to search all these SharePoint sites because the effective model is the intersection of the application so that user only has the ability to read certain SharePoint sites when they're using this application. They too, again, only have the ability to use that search on the SharePoint sites that they have access to. So what I'm trying to say is you're not really granting people more permissions than they normally would have used in this delegation permission model. It still is what the user has and what the application is able to do. This sometimes is called scopes OAuth 2 permission grants or app plus user permissions. We really, really want you to use the applications that is using the delegated permission model. Now, the second type of the permission model is called application permissions. And these are used by apps without anyone being signed in our presence. These can run fully in the background, no user required, and whatever permission that you grant to the application in the application permission model is the permission that the application has the ability to do. So if there's some permission that is asking for the ability to do directory rewrite all, the application has the ability to do directory rewrite all. There's no intersection whatsoever like what we grant an application can do. So think about these are really extremely powerful permissions that we want to make sure we understand why application needs those permissions and why it has to have this permission model. We really, really want to use the delegated permission model with the intersection application permissions. And the application permissions are always required for admins to consent, and users cannot consent to this. This is sometimes called roles, or app-only permissions. All right, let's dig into the permission types here. So we have this nice slide here that tells you about the different permission types. It is kind of a summary of everything to recap. It is a lot of information that if you ever looked at this before, we have two types of permissions. We have delegated application permissions, and the delegated model is going to be those mobile apps, those web apps, and the single page applications. Both end users or admins can grant to this. Admins can consent to those for all the users in the organization. And this requires a user to be signed in and present. It is the effective permission model, which is a combination of what the end user has as well as what the application has. The other permission model, which is the application permission model, is when run as a service and only can be consented by an administrator. Whatever permissions we grant, that is what the application has the ability to do. So very, very powerful. We want applications to use the delegated permission model, not the application permissions, if we can help it. With that, Oana is going to show you a quick demo of this consent framework. Oana?
Thank you so much, Gloria. I think that was great. We had, I think, maybe 10 minutes of talking about the different terms, and it's time to see that in action. So I'm going to show you both the end user experience and the admin experience and see what exactly it looks like when an application is requesting consent. So here I will start by showing you the end user experience. I have here my user, Alice Smith, and I'm trying to access an application that I never tried to access before. And I see that I need approval in order to access this application. So I see also that there is a good mix of application permissions and delegated permissions. So I see first sign in and read user profile. Well, maybe that's something that most applications are requesting. But I also see a list of application permissions, so having full controls on all site collections, having that read-write access to all site collections. And I see that I actually need to request or access and also give a justification. So I will need to send my admin a reason for why I need to access this application. And if there's anything that the user may find suspicious about this application, we also have the report it here button where the user can provide more information about why this application doesn't necessarily look right, or maybe request a higher number of permissions than expected. So let's see how that would look like from an admin perspective. Um, Give me one moment to move this over to this screen. So here I'm logged in with the global admin, and I'm trying to access the same application. And I no longer see that approval required, but actually right now I see, well, this application is requiring this permissions. And if I consent, so if I accept, this application will be registered in the tenant and other users will be able to access it without seeing this screen. So without seeing that approval is required screen. Something else besides the permissions, again, you can see the same list of permissions and you can drill into what the exact permission that's required. But something else that I wanted to call out here is also that this application is not a Microsoft registered application, or is not what we call publisher verified. And we will talk about this a little bit more later in the presentation. But what it means is that this application is not Microsoft vetted, so it hasn't been registered using a Microsoft partner account. So that's the other thing that, as an admin, you can verify and see if this is a legitimate application. And also, similarly to the end user experience, as an admin, you can go ahead and report the application if you think that this is an application that should be disabled, and it shouldn't have the ability to be registered to other tenants. Or if everything looks good, you can decide to go ahead and accept those permissions, which means that all users moving forward from this moment will be able to access this application without seeing that consent screen. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what happened there. So we saw the experience. You're probably familiar with applications requiring consent, but what happened behind the scenes? When we talk about applications and what forms an application, we have the application object and the service principal object. When you think about the application object, well, that will always reside in the home tenant. So that's the first tenant where the application has been registered. And you can think about the definition about that application. So think application logo, application name, optional claims that you may add to that application. While service principal can reside in multiple tenants, and it contains the configuration of that application. So think your own sign-on URLs or reply URLs that are specific to your tenant. And just to give a real-life example, so let's say Gloria and I have this timekeeping application and we have registered it in our tenant. So if you're familiar with the Azure AD portal, we have a blade which is called app registrations. And that's where you would register, you will go and register your application. And both application and service principal objects are residing right now in our tenant. But then we decide to sell it or publish it to the Azure AD gallery. If someone else registers this application in their tenant, only the service principal representation of our application will be installed in the other tenants. Why is it also important to have this differentiation between application and service principal objects? Is because authentication will always happen against the service principal object. So it cannot happen against the application object. So here we can give a few examples about what we see in customers' environments, for example. So if we start looking at service principles, we can see when investigating or monitoring applications inside the environments, we can see that some of these service principles actually hold some high privileges. Sometimes they have Azure role assignments or directory role assignments. So think of things like global admin. So you have right now a service principle that holds the keys to the kingdom, right? Or if one maybe make an analogy to Active Directory where we had service accounts, and service accounts could maybe run scheduled tasks or run services such as SQL services. Very similarly, service principals can have that type of privilege in Azure AD too. And if they are holding things like application permission grants, well, that means that that service principal can make changes and can act as a non-human identity and can make changes without requiring any signed in user. And if you couple that again with high privilege grants, you can understand why we care so much about, well, first understanding the service principle usage in your environment, and then making sure that you're also governing access to service principles very closely.
Yes, Oana. So I know somebody here right now is probably thinking just like Grandpa Simpson. And like I know the cloud was a problem from the start, it's trouble. And now I have all these applications in my tenant. I don't know how they get there. I don't know who assigned their access. I don't know who can access and who cannot. So I have all these permissions. The application can do things in my directory. I have no idea how this happened. Like, I know this is cloud's fault, and we should never have done this cloud thing to begin with. So it's really not as bad as it seems. Well, we have some stuff, some tools that will give you guys, help this make this easier, turning some doorknobs. But we dare to ask the same question here, right? It's actually for most customers worse on premises because on premises, do you have a centralized place where the application's coming through? It's worse because we don't know who's accessing those application on premises. It's worse because we actually don't know what permissions the application that's asking for. And the application may have asked for something like domain admin. And then what permission is it really using? Can you even tell what you don't know? So things like that, probably it's worse on-prem. However, in the cloud, we have some good stuff that is going to help you with this. So why are we even talking a lot about this? Well, because we have definitely crazy malware campaigns that is evolving. Um, you know, since COVID, it's really been explosive, and it's really got to run the users to click on the phishing emails and run those macros and cause into the illicit consent grant because the users don't know what they're consenting. It is becoming a evolving landscape threat here, and we wanted you to to point out here that an attacker, right? They registered an app with OAuth 2.0 providers such as Azure Active Directory, and the app is configured in a trustworthy, like using a name of a popular product, the some ecosystem. The attacker gets a link in front of users, which may be done through conventional email-based phishing and the non-malicious website or other techniques, right? Then a user clicks on it, is shown like authentic consent prompt that's asking them to grant malicious app permissions to data. If a user clicks to accept, they'll grant the app permissions to access sensitive data, and the app gets authorization code, which it redeems from an access token and potentially a refresh token. The access token is used to make API calls on behalf of that user. Yes, so it's actually pretty crazy. Well, with that, we're going to have Oana to look through with you guys to talk about actually the key permissions. And then Oana's also going to take you through another great demo to work on how to investigate illicit consent grants. With that, I'm going to give it to Oana.
Thanks so much, Gloria. And yeah, you mentioned that you have all these applications and you don't know how did they get there in the first place, right? And let's say you have them there, and then how do you start going about permissions? And what are the permissions that you should be looking for? So these are all fair and legitimate questions. Because if we think of all the permissions that are out there, maybe there are hundreds or thousands of permissions. It will be so hard to just stay and sift through them all, or maybe try to classify all of them up front. That probably is just not feasible. So that's why just looking at our own research and what we're seeing when working with so many customers around the world is probably these permissions on the left hand side are probably being used in 90% of the consent related or phishing related attacks. So whether that's mail star, contact star, and when we're putting these root permissions, it's actually all the permutations of these permissions. It can be contacts read write, contacts read write shared. So it's and maybe some of these are not, you wouldn't consider them risky because mail read is a common one, right? But what we're noticing is that usually attackers are not necessarily going after admins or those high permissions where admins might pay more attention or be more educated about what that permissions means, but actually also try to access or to request access to these benign permissions, and then eventually moving laterally from there. So that's why we do want it to call out everything that is related to mail or everything that is related to contacts or people or files. So that is hosting really that contains information, PII information, to also pay attention to and take a closer look to. And then on the right hand side, talking about application permissions or domain read write all permissions. So these permissions that, in case they were abused, that could have a catastrophic impact, right? And no one else better than yourselves know the environment. So if you know that maybe this high level I don't know, HR person or a finance person has consented to this type of permissions, well, maybe there is something that you should look into. And on the opposite side, you can have I don't know, you can have maybe requesting admin consent for everything, even for things that are already inside the tokens when the user signs in. So maybe something like OpenID or email or their profile. So things that are already there when the user is signing in. So maybe these are the, let's say, the safer ones or the ones that you could consider low risk and maybe allow users to consent to this type of permission, so you don't overwhelm admins with every single access request to applications. So let's just see how that looks like, right? In just in the portal, how we are looking at applications. And here I'm logged in with my admin user, and I just went to enterprise applications, and then I noticed first that this application is misspelled. That's definitely not how my tenant is spelled. So I decide to take a closer look at this application, and you see here a massive list of permissions, a mix of delegated, but mostly application permissions. And remember, these application permissions don't require signed in user to make changes or to do whatever these permission grants them access to. So just to take a few examples, read all users authentication methods, or if we scroll down, read and write all applications. So just this application can go and create other applications without having any signed in users. So that's where it's important to take a look at applications that you have registered in your environment, and then look also at the permissions that are associated to these applications. And we will also show other approaches of doing this. We understand that it may not be feasible for every single customer to look in the Azure AD portal and just go through every single application. So we will also show you how you can add a little bit of automation to that. But just before doing that, the other thing that I wanted to illustrate here when talking about application permission. So let's take the example of Microsoft Graph, because we know that's a common one. It has application permission, so it can make changes without having any signed in user. So here you could be signed in to, or this could be an application having this type of application permissions like Microsoft Graph. And let's say we take the example of my user Alice Smith, and I want to go and just make changes. And just so that you remember that apps can do this, I'll just change the display name to this. I'll change the operation to patch, and then I'll go ahead and run my query. And just to show you that worked, I'll then do a get and see that the display name has changed. So this is an example of an application having application permissions that can make changes without having any signed in users. And again, understanding why it is important to pay a closer attention to this type of permissions, and only allow them when it's absolutely needed and absolutely necessary. Okay, so with that, I'll just go back to the presentation and just cover how you can investigate, how you can discover these applications and the permissions that are associated to them. So a few options. If you're mainly using Office 365, then probably the O365 portal is a good place to start, where you can look for what we call indicators of compromise, IOCs. And a good place to start probably is admin content is set to true. So that means that there was a global admin that consented for that application. So just having a list of, or looking at the applications that required admin consent would be a good place to start. And this approach can work, again, if you're mostly using Office 365 and maybe you don't have yet a lot of SaaS applications registered in your tenant. If you do have applications in Azure AD, and if you went and register different apps or having multi-tenant applications, for example, so consenting to register applications in your tenant, then the Azure AD portal can also be an option. So just like I did a few minutes ago, looking at the Enterprise Blade and selecting the application in question and starting looking at the permissions that are assigned to it. But again, that depending on the number of applications, that may not be a feasible thing to do. So that's why probably the one, if we're going from good, better, PowerShell would be the better option. And this is where our colleagues have developed a script that actually goes through every service principal and the permissions that are associated to it. And not only it gives you that data, but also it has some nice reports, pre-canned reports that you can go analyze, that makes your investigation easier, because you will see things like high-risk apps or high-risk users that consented maybe to risky permissions or applications that are not Microsoft registered or that are not Microsoft first party. So that's the one that I will show you in a minute, just how the export looks like and how you can really benefit from that type of analysis. And if we're going to the best option, probably it will be Microsoft Cloud App Security or a CASB appliance, because that will also allow you to tie some automation. You probably won't have time. You probably don't have staff lying around just waiting for the bus to go off and then investigate those applications. So you probably want some automation around it so that if a risk of permission is being requested, or if the application itself doesn't match what you're allowing for your organization in terms of which applications can be registered, then they can just be disabled, or they don't even have the ability to be registered in your tenant, or all the grants are being revoked. So probably that's the best option to make sure that you have that kind of automatic response in case something bad happens. Okay, so also related to the export, where do you start? Okay, so we talked about high risk apps, that's great, high risk users, but what else? What else? If you have gone through the list of high risk applications and high risk users, what are other IOCs that you can look for? So maybe the permissions. So looking at the applications that have application permissions or delegated all principals, which means that applications has permissions for and has been consented for all users in the directory. That's probably another thing that you would like to you may want to take a closer look at. Okay, so I promised you that I will show you that export. So I actually did run the export earlier, and this is how it looks like. So I ran the script from the slide before in my tenant earlier, and this is the first tab that you will see, which is just the raw data. So probably a few hundreds of applications here. Your organization may have less or more, but still probably pretty hard to make sense of this data or sift through the applications. So that's where I think this pivot table is really valuable, because here you have different filters that you can apply just to know where to start. Maybe even from seeing the list of permissions. So you see low risk permissions, some that are unranked, and just as I mentioned before, because there are so many permissions out there, it's just not feasible to classify every single one. So you will still see some that are unranked, and also the high risk permissions, and that will usually be the application permissions, delegated all principal permissions, and also one of the ones that I was showing you in the previous slides, the key permissions to look for. So if I want here, for example, to only look maybe at high risk permissions, you could go and select only high risk permissions, and that way you can shrink the amount of data that you can start with. And again, maybe there are some that you're expecting to be there, like Microsoft Graph, Windows Azure AD, Azure Key Vault. Maybe that's good, but maybe you don't know, I don't know, the AIP on behalf of, or I don't know, Lookout MTP or Woodgrove. You know your environment better than anyone else, and just by seeing these application names and services that they have access to may already give you some information about what you should be looking at next. The other tab that I wanted to show you, as I was mentioning before, is the high risk users tab. So here you will have the list of users that have consented to high risk permissions, and usually these permissions are also available to all users. So there has been an admin that has granted consent on behalf of the entire organization for this application. So here's where knowing your environment and knowing maybe the people from the leadership team, you can start looking at those users, or we can start with analyzing or looking at more information or more applications that those users have consented to, instead of just starting analyzing every single application or every single high-profile user in your organization. And the other one that I also wanted to show you, because I think it also gives you that view of the applications that are classified as high risk in your environment, by looking at 3 key indicators. So the first one will be high risk permissions. Then it will be the user's assigned count. So again, applications that are assigned to all users, and whether or not that's a Microsoft first-party application, so Microsoft registered application. And you will see that in all these cases that we are looking at applications that are not Microsoft registered. And again, you can take a look here and see, well, maybe there are applications with misspelled names, or I don't know, bland names like email, or things that you weren't aware of. And just because they are appearing in this list, that's a big motivator to just take a closer look at what that application actually does and who consented to it. Okay, so hopefully this was useful, and I hope that you will go ahead and try the script, and also give us feedback, because we're also looking at ways of improving it. So in terms of other things to look at when analyzing that export and when investigating consent grants in your environment. So apart from the misspelled names that we saw, or bland names, you can also look at application activity and user activity. So maybe you know that this application can only be accessed from this type of device at this time of the day, and you have policies for that. If there were access requests maybe outside of those policy constraints, maybe that's something that you should take a closer look at. And similarly, from the user's side, right? If this user usually works 9 to 5, and right now all of a sudden is trying to log in at 2 a.m. from Paris, when they're actually in Seattle, maybe that's something else that you should take a closer look at. And if you suspect maybe that's something that you have malicious activity in your tenant, just looking at when that application got created, and maybe if it was created in a time that it was close to the moment of compromise, or where you suspect compromise, that can also be a key indicator and a key piece of information that can help you understand whether or not that application is actually a legitimate app. And why we care about that is understanding the blast radius, right? When you probably have heard about microsegmentation, and as much as possible trying to build those walls, so that in case something blows up, well, the damage is done only within those constraints. So if you know, for example, that the compromise happened in Office 365 Exchange, well, then you can start looking there and start from there, because that will save you time, rather than just trying to look everywhere. And just because we're talking about Exchange Online, something that you can take a look at is also things like mail forwarding rules, right? Gloria was mentioning earlier, in case that's turned on, well, we know that even maybe identifying the compromise and maybe disabling sign-in, or trying to address it will not also help with the damage that could have been done in other places. So I think this is a good time probably to talk about what do we do when compromise is confirmed. So when you identified the compromise, what happens next? And we were talking about trying to identify the blast radius, right? So the containment, and then trying to remediate it. And there are different ways that you can go about doing that. Whether you have identified the service principal that's a legitimate or malicious service principal, well, you can go and disable it, or revoke all the permission grants that have been assigned to that service principals, or in case there are app role assignments, deleting and removing those app role assignments. If you know the account was compromised, then you are sure that you would like to just disable sign into that user until you have a better idea about what happened and the plan, and the remediation plan. You can temporarily disable sign in for that account. And the most important one, again, that we see that is skipped because probably is the hardest one, is trying to find persistence. So the attacker tries to abuse trust, maybe through a malicious application. And depending on maybe what permissions that application had, we can start looking into other different areas, such as mail forwarding rules. Okay, so I hope I didn't scare you all too much, because we do have some best practices coming up next that can help you protect yourself from this type of attack.
Okay, well, cover some best practices. So what are some of the best practices here? Let's see. Well, first thing, set policies. Inside the Azure portal, you can decide who can consent to applications within your organization. As you can see in the screenshot on the left, you have 3 buttons. You can prohibit your users from consenting to applications whatsoever, allow your user to consent to all the apps. Both of these are not the best decisions. What we do recommend is allow users to consent to apps that are from verified publishers, and for selected permissions that you decide as an organization that are considered safe or low impact. Another option shown on the right-hand side of the screenshot, if you have MCAS or other um, CASB tools. So MCAS is the Microsoft Cloud App Security tool. You can set up app permissions policies, which will automatically revoke an app or a user of an app based on certain risks detected in your environment. Let's see. All right, so let's talk about the risk-based user step-up consent. The second best practice that it is to use the for you to track risk-based user consent. It is currently enabled by default. So what is a step-up consent? When a risky request is detected, the request will be stepped up to require admin approval. Users and admins will see the warning, but admins will have the ability to actually approve it. When this happens, an audit event will be logged. As we all know, logs are only useful if we check them and take action. If there's an app requesting applications you don't know about, this can be an indicator that the user has been phished. This may have come as an email attachment, but you end up catching it here. As admins, you want to have a process in place when these requests comes in that they don't just hang in there. It is important to assign owners and take action based on what you see in your audit logs. Let's talk about how to detect those risky OAuth apps. All right, so next, how do we detect them, right? So how do we detect these apps? We just talked about, apply to the new applications that's coming through the environment. So now how do we look at what's already happened in our environment? So the first one there, Oana had to walk us through, is the really, really nice script. The script will dump out all those permissions. You can look through it. the pivot tables, all kinds of good stuff. It's a good place to start. It's free, but requires some manual work to be done. Run the script in your environment, comb through the app and permissions. It'll help you identify anything that looks overprivileged or questionable. Better yet, we recommend using Azure Monitor to set up alerts to automate the process for you. For example, send notification when an OAuth app requires high permissions or authorize for a significant chunk of users. The ideal option is to do some risky app hunting. With CASB solutions such as MCAS or other tools, you can use filters to find apps that are potentially very risky where users may have underestimated the risk. Some of the things you can filter on is high permissions, right? Not common use or authorization by external users. All right, the next thing here, we're going to get started in front of this is with your developers. I'm going to advance the slide here. Well, so the developers that you're currently working with, which are going to be your internal developers as well as external developers, we're putting out new permissions all the time, making it easy to scope app with granular permissions. One of the common things we see with line of business apps is that devs are not following the least privilege. In my previous life, managing on-premises Active Directory, many times I get asked to provide access to the line of business apps. And many times I get asked to assign domain admin permissions, not because it's intentional, but because it is just simply easier. And most likely the developers are not aware of the least privilege concept and the security risks associated with it. So this is, by no means a new problem. However, we really want to encourage developers to follow the least privilege. So only ask for what is necessary. So take a look at those guidance we have highlighted here. They're excellent resources to help educate the developers, especially the identity platform checklist. Highly recommended. As Microsoft Teams is becoming more and more popular, you want to make sure if you're using it that the app can only access the teams that they need. Take a look at the team specific permissions. We have included the link here in the deck to get started. Last but not least, we recommend both IT pros and devs to watch the Identity Dev series that we created. So go to ak.ms Identity Developer Series. About 2.5 hours of YouTube video. You will not regret it. If you're a cybersecurity or defenders, definitely should watch this. We received so many great feedback that IT pros and dev pros learned so much from this video series, and it goes deeper into API calls to Microsoft Graph, permissions and scopes, access tokens, client credential flow, and all very valuable for both IT pros and devs. Last thing here, if you see anything, say something. Well, let me advance the slide. If you see an application and it looks suspicious, you can report it through or consent screen as well. So the checkbox right there below for the admins here, you can report those applications that you think are phishing or suspicious to us. And we will take a look at it and we'll take action and remove them for everybody. So if you see something, please take action. All right. So let's recap on some go-dos here, shall we? Well, first go back to the bare minimum. Run that PowerShell script. Look at your applications. Look for those dangerous permissions. Look for those risky users. Investigate, fix it, set the right permissions. Do inventory of your applications, their permissions. Is always important to know what is in your environment. Automate threat response where possible. Educate your organization about consent tactics. We are not here to scare you. We don't want to, but we have not seen these attacks a ton yet. But because it's emerging, we see customers who are being hit with these types of attacks. We want to make sure you're aware of how to watch out for them. Educate your developers, right, to ensure that they follow best security practices around using least privilege. We have some links for you, especially ak.ms Azure AD SecOps Guide. It gives you a detailed step toward how to monitor more applications. There are so much more to talk about on this topic. We can talk all day. Well, the time is going to come to end. So lastly, we've included some extra resources links. So when you get the slides, you'll be able to access them. And again, My name's Gloria Lee, and with my beautiful colleague Oana Enache, and you can contact us either via Twitter, email. We're also on LinkedIn, but we're here to really help you guys. Any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out and ping, and let's make sure that you guys do take those best practice and go-dos, and make a difference in your environment. Thank you.